April 12, 1945. Europe's cannons had not yet fallen silent, but their roar had become a weary gasp. Across the scarred landscape of southern Germany, the pale April sun struggled to pierce the gray shroud of smoke hanging over towns that were slowly dying. Fields once vibrant green now lay mangled, crosshatched with the indelible tracks of tanks and pockmarked by the frozen craters of explosions. The monumental war had entered its final, shuddering act, and the entire world seemed to collectively hold its breath. American columns of the 7th Army pressed onward, past the skeletal ruins of Nuremberg, their engines droning a low, tired rhythm like an exhausted heart. They had witnessed every conceivable horror: burned-out convoys, civilians hollowed by starvation, and soldiers still fighting for a cause already consigned to history's grave. Yet, despite all they had endured, nothing could have truly prepared them for the discovery that lay ahead. On the periphery of a tiny Bavarian village named Schwag, a schoolhouse stood in partial collapse, its structure mangled. Wisps of smoke still curled lazily from its broken roof, while the nearby church bell had melted under intense heat, now an inert lump of bronze. A small squad of American infantry advanced cautiously, rifles held ready, their boots crunching on fragments of glass and the fine dust of chalk. They braced themselves for an ambush, perhaps a last desperate stand by fanatic Hitler Youth. Instead, an entirely different sound reached them. Not the sharp cries of wounded men, but the thin, piercing wails of babies. Inside, the surviving walls were crudely lined with makeshift cots fashioned from broken desks. Sheets, tattered and worn, hung like somber surrender flags. Amidst the debris, the sharp tang of disinfectant, and the acrid smell of burned plaster, a dozen young women in soiled nurse uniforms moved with a spectral grace. Their Red Cross armbands, once stark red, were now faded to a pale pink, stained by a mixture of blood and rain. One of them, a girl no older than 20, her blonde hair darkened with soot, gently rocked a baby in her arms, while another diligently boiled water over a dented enamel bowl. They froze, statues of fear, as the soldiers stepped through the doorway. The rifles, the helmets, the unfamiliar faces of men speaking a language that, to them, had only ever signaled danger. For a long, agonizing moment, neither side stirred. Then, the sergeant leading the group, Corporal David Miller, a man who had been a quiet farmhand in Illinois before the war, was the first to lower his weapon. "It's all right," he murmured softly. The German nurses understood nothing of the words, but his gentle tone spoke volumes. One of the nurses, trembling visibly, took a small, hesitant step forward. She gestured toward the crying infant in her arms, then to the empty bottle lying beside her, speaking a rapid, urgent stream of German. Miller turned to his medic. "She says there's no milk," the medic translated, his voice laced with uncertainty. "None left for 2 days." Outside, heavy trucks rumbled past, their destination the next village down the road. Standard military orders were clear: clear the area, move on, and secure the next objective. But Miller stayed. His gaze swept the room. A chalkboard covered in arithmetic, now smeared and blackened by smoke. A child's shoe half buried beneath the rubble. And everywhere, the unmistakable, sickening scent of hunger. The nurses were gaunt, their eyes hollowed, and their fear was palpable. Not of death itself, but of the very men standing before them. For years, they had been indoctrinated to believe Americans were monsters. Yet here these monsters stood, momentarily paralyzed by the sound of infants, babies too weak even to cry out properly. A tiny cough, a frail, rattling sound, suddenly silenced the entire room. Miller exhaled slowly. "Get the jeep," he said quietly, "and bring what's left of the field rations." Within mere minutes, the Americans returned, carrying a few dented cans of condensed milk, a single mess tin, and a handful of matches. It was a pitifully small offering, barely enough. The women watched in silence as the soldiers awkwardly attempted to heat the milk, stirring it clumsily with the handle of a bayonet. One of the nurses, after a moment of hesitation, stepped forward and gently took the tin. She made a subtle gesture for them to stop. She would handle it. The soldiers instinctively stepped back, observing as she carefully poured the warm milk into a cracked glass bottle, testing its temperature on her wrist before offering it to the smallest infant. The baby latched on immediately, its whimpers quieting. A subtle, profound shift occurred in the air, a silence now filled not with lingering fear, but with a dawning astonishment. Miller instinctively scratched the back of his neck. "They're not soldiers," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. The medic nodded in agreement. "No," he replied softly, "just people trying to keep other people alive." For the nurses, the Americans remained an enigma. They had arrived armed, loud, and utterly alien, yet their eyes visibly softened at the sound of a baby's cry. When an interpreter finally arrived from headquarters, communication became possible, though still tentative. The Americans inquired about their identities and what had transpired. The nurses explained that the hospital in Nuremberg had been bombed, forcing them to flee with the infants, desperately seeking refuge in the countryside. Some of the babies were German, others refugees from the East, all of them abandoned after their mothers had been killed or succumbed to starvation on the perilous journey. They had survived on rainwater and meager mashed potatoes, but their last supplies had now vanished. As dusk began to settle, the Americans lit lanterns and brought blankets from their truck. The barn adjacent to the schoolhouse was swiftly cleared of straw and transformed into a rudimentary shelter. The women were informed they could rest there for the night. One nurse, her name barely audible, Annalise, thanked them in halting, broken English. "For the children," she managed, her voice cracking with emotion. Miller, unsure how to respond, simply nodded. Back home, he had a 4-year-old daughter with curls much like the child Annalise held. He hadn't seen her since 1943. Looking at the baby in Annalise's arms, he suddenly felt an immense distance from any notion of victory. By the time the moon cast its pale light, the barn flickered with a quiet, internal glow. Inside, soldiers now sat alongside the nurses, passing bottles and cups, attempting to measure portions with the same meticulous precision they might apply to artillery calculations. Someone began to hum an old American lullaby, and one of the German women softly joined in, almost without conscious thought. It was the first time any of them had sung in months. Outside, the distant echo of gunfire resonated like fading thunder. The front line continued its inexorable push north toward the Danube, leaving behind scattered pockets of surrender and disbelief. But within the walls of that humble barn, a different kind of battle was quietly concluding, the profound struggle between the abstract idea of an enemy and the undeniable reality of another human being. Later, when the soldiers reported their unusual find, a lieutenant asked Miller why he had delayed their advance. Miller simply stated, "We found something that needed guarding." The lieutenant frowned, clearly perplexed. "A German hospital?" Miller looked back toward the barn, where faint cries mingled with hushed voices. "No," he said quietly. "Life." The war would relentlessly grind on for a few more weeks. Town after town would fall. Hitler would eventually die. The Reich would collapse in ruin. But that night in Schwag, beneath a tattered patch of starlight filtering through a broken roof, a handful of soldiers and nurses shared a brief, fragile ceasefire of the soul. When dawn finally arrived, frost meticulously coated the fields. Smoke, a promise of warmth, curled lazily from the barn's chimney. Someone had meticulously built a small fire to heat the milk. The soldiers began their preparations to move again. The nurses stood nearby, clutching their blankets tightly, their faces etched with uncertainty, unsure if they would be abandoned or taken prisoner. The interpreter reassured them that the Americans would return after securing the next town. They nodded, but their eyes clearly conveyed their disbelief. As the convoy slowly pulled away, one of the babies began to cry once more. Miller glanced back through the swirling dust and exhaust, catching sight of Annalise as she gently lifted the child. Cradling it close, her face turned toward the nascent sun. For a fleeting, powerful moment, he imagined her as any mother, in any country, in the aftermath of any war. The jeep jolted forward, and the barn receded, growing smaller and smaller behind them, eventually swallowed by the morning mist. The war had not yet concluded, but something fundamental within Miller had, and though he couldn't have known it then, that would not be his last encounter with those nurses. By the second morning, the barn was infused with the mingled scents of smoke, warm milk, and damp straw. Sunlight, like stolen gold, leaked through the gaps in the wooden walls, striping the faces of the German nurses as they worked. Outside, a truck engine idled somewhere beyond the frost-laden fields, its steady hum a persistent, quiet heartbeat. Inside, life itself clung to the air, fragile, uncertain, yet undeniably vibrant. The Americans had, against all expectations, returned as promised, bringing more cans of milk, precious soap, and a few tins of rations. They carried their gear with an unfamiliar awkwardness, almost as if embarrassed by the gentle nature of their mission. None of them had ever anticipated fighting a war that would culminate in the tender act of feeding babies. The barn, once a shelter for cattle, now housed 23 infants, wrapped snugly in blankets hastily torn from army tents. Some were tiny orphans from bomb trains, others born to mothers who had tragically perished on the roadside. The nurses knew each delicate face, each faint whimper, each shallow, precious breath. They moved with quiet purpose between the cots, sleeves rolled up to their elbows, hair neatly tied back with scraps of gauze. Their hands were raw and reddened from countless hours of scrubbing bottles in cold water, yet their movements possessed a methodical rhythm, the quiet discipline of people who stubbornly refused to yield to chaos. Corporal David Miller entered with the medic and interpreter, stamping snow from his boots. "Morning," he offered, though the word emerged more like a hesitant question. The interpreter relayed it in German. Annalise, engrossed in her task, merely nodded, barely glancing up. She was feeding a child no larger than a loaf of bread, its small blue eyes fluttering with uncertainty. Miller paused, then placed a box of supplies near her feet. "More milk," he said, "from Nuremberg base." The interpreter translated, and Annalise softly murmured, "Danke," a simple thank you. It struck Miller how utterly natural that word sounded in this humble place, so far removed from the world that had relentlessly taught them to hate one another. He watched as she carefully tilted the bottle, ensuring not a single drop was spilled. Around her, the other nurses conversed in low tones, a gentle mix of German whispers and soft lullabies. The air inside was noticeably warmer now. The ingenious Americans had repaired the stove, cleverly rigging it with spare parts salvaged from a Jeep engine. The soldiers had even scrounged tin cups and established a system of turns. Nurses fed the babies, soldiers fetched water, and someone diligently kept the fire burning. The inherent absurdity of the situation did not escape anyone. "Guess this is one way to win hearts and minds," one private muttered under his breath, earning a sharp glare from the medic. The interpreter, a young man from New York whose German was still halting, attempted to bridge the lingering silence. He cautiously asked the nurses about their work, their former homes, their training. Most demurred, unsure of his true purpose. Finally, Annalise spoke softly. "We are Red Cross. No politics, only blood and crying." Miller understood perfectly, even without translation. He studied her face, not with attraction, but with a profound sense of recognition. She looked, he thought, much like his own wife might have, had the war spared her the torment of sleepless nights. Hours unfolded in a strange, fragile stillness. Outside, the distant rumble of artillery echoed like a coming storm. Inside, time seemed to stretch thin, delicate. The babies slept peacefully. The nurses whispered quiet prayers over them. Occasionally, a soldier would offer an awkward smile, unsure what to do with his unaccustomed hands. These were men forged and trained for destruction, now tasked with guarding the most utterly defenseless beings on earth. The profound irony of it permeated every gesture, every quiet moment. In a far corner, one of the younger nurses, Greta, accidentally spilled a precious pot of milk. It hissed dramatically as it struck the hot stove. She gasped, then instantly dissolved into tears, overwhelmed by sheer exhaustion. Without a moment's thought, Miller knelt beside her, awkwardly patting her shoulder. "It's okay," he said. She didn't comprehend the words, but the compassion in his tone reached her. Covering her face, she whispered, "Alice ist verloren." The interpreter translated softly. "She says, everything is lost." Miller looked around, at the makeshift cots, the shivering infants, the resilient women who simply refused to stop working, and shook his head. "Not everything," he said quietly. By evening, snow began to fall once more. The barn, bathed in the soft, flickering light of lanterns hung from nails, cast a warm glow over tired faces. A subtle shift had occurred. The nurses had begun to trust the soldiers enough to allow them to hold the babies. There was even laughter now, hesitant and fragile, but undeniably real. One medic, O'Hara from Boston, was attempting to gently rock a child in his massive arms. The baby, however, screamed in protest, and the nurses, to their own astonishment, laughed. The first time any of them had genuinely laughed since the war began. O'Hara grinned sheepishly. "Guess I'm better at fixing men than feeding 'em," he conceded. Analyze reached over, gently adjusting his hold, showing him how to properly support the baby's delicate neck. When the infant finally quieted, she uttered something in German that required no translation. "Gentle." Later, as they ate from shared tins of stew, conversation bloomed like a cautious spring flower. The interpreter translated jokes, some only half understood, but enough to elicit genuine smiles. The nurses learned the Americans' names, Miller, O'Hara, Jameson, Reed, and the men in turn learned theirs. For a few precious hours, there were no sides, no flags, no military orders. Only shared exhaustion and the small, sustaining warmth of human company. Yet, outside that fragile circle of light, the world still burned. A passing patrol brought unsettling news. Rumors of surrender, streams of refugees, the sporadic crackle of gunfire on the road. The visiting lieutenant frowned, clearly disapproving of what he observed. "We can't stay here," he told Miller brusquely. "HQ wants all civilians moved by dawn." Miller protested. "They're nurses, sir." "The babies." But the officer cut him off. "Orders. We move them to the main camp tomorrow. Don't get attached." That night, Miller found sleep elusive. The barn creaked rhythmically in the biting wind. He sat near the door, his rifle resting across his knees, listening to the quiet, vital breathing inside. The babies made small sounds, snuffles, soft sighs, tiny hiccups, and each tiny sound felt heavier, more profound, than the oppressive silence between gunshots. His thoughts drifted once more to his daughter back home, her photograph, its edges worn white, folded carefully in his jacket pocket. War had stripped him of nearly everything. His friends, his peace of mind, the simple concept of tranquility. Yet here, amidst people he had been taught to despise as enemies, he had unexpectedly found something startlingly close to it. Annalise woke and approached him quietly, wrapping a shawl tightly around her shoulders. She pointed at the dwindling fire, then at him. "You cold?" she asked, her accent heavy but earnest. He offered a faint smile. "A little." She hesitated, then added, "Tomorrow we go." He nodded, the single word heavy with resignation. "Orders." Her expression remained impassive, but her shoulders seemed to subtly shrink inward. "Baby's safe?" she asked. He gazed into the flickering fire for a long moment before answering, his voice firm. "I'll make sure of it." She nodded once, a single, silent affirmation, and returned to her cot. As she lay down, she hummed a lullaby so soft he could barely discern it. The words were foreign, but the melody stirred a deep chord within him, reminding him unmistakably of home. Before dawn, a fresh blanket of snow covered everything again. The lieutenant's trucks arrived, their headlights cutting harsh, intrusive beams through the thick fog. The nurses gathered their meager belongings. Bundles of cloth, makeshift bottles, a few scraps of food. The babies were carefully loaded into crates lined with straw, each one a precious cargo. The soldiers moved with quiet, practiced efficiency, their faces impassive, almost masks. It was supposed to be a routine transfer, yet it felt unmistakably like an ending. As the engine sputtered to life, Miller cast one last look back at the barn. The stove was dying out, its warmth dissipating. The milk cans were stacked neatly by the door, an orderly farewell. On the wall, a child's drawing, perhaps found and tacked up, depicted a son, a house, and a family holding hands. It trembled faintly in the draft, like something fragile and alive. He climbed into the jeep, and the convoy lurched forward, tires crunching over the frozen mud. The barn receded into the gray distance until it was merely another blur in a landscape scarred by ruins. He didn't know it then, but within days that barn would evolve into something else entirely. Part refuge, part scandal, and part closely guarded secret. It would become a place where mercy had dared to exist, and where mercy, as it so often is in war, would be profoundly misunderstood. The convoy reached the outskirts of Ansbach by noon, crawling through a world that seemed half dead, half poised for an uncertain rebirth. The fields were deeply pocked with shell holes, the trees stripped bare of their branches. Wisps of smoke drifted lazily from the chimneys of houses that no longer possessed intact walls. The war was undoubtedly drawing to a close, but no one could yet articulate what new reality would emerge in its wake. Inside the trucks, the German nurses sat in stoic silence, each clutching an infant, their faces caught between a lingering fear and a dawning disbelief. The American soldiers escorting them remained largely quiet. They were, after all, soldiers, not shepherds, and this strange mission, this unexpected task of protecting their former enemies, felt like stepping entirely off the map of what war was traditionally supposed to mean. They eventually arrived at a requisition monastery perched on a hill outside the town. Its courtyard was muddy and churned from melted snow, and a single white flag hung limply from a window, a silent testament to surrender. Inside, American medics had already set up cots and tables. The air was a potent mixture of iodine, hay, and the sharp tang of diesel. The women were ushered into one wing, the soldiers took the other, and an uneasy, tenuous peace settled over the ancient building. No one was quite sure who was the prisoner and who was the guest. Corporal Miller worked alongside the medics all afternoon, establishing sanitation stations and diligently unloading supplies. Every so often, his gaze would drift toward the doorway where the nurses stood in their faded gray uniforms, patiently waiting for direction. The interpreter struggled to accurately convey the new orders. They were to remain under protective custody until the front lines had stabilized. Annalise listened intently, her eyes unwavering. She asked if they would be permitted to continue caring for the babies. When the interpreter nodded, she seemed to exhale fully for the first time in hours. "Then we stay," she said quietly, her resolve clear. Word of their presence spread quickly through the nearby villages. Locals soon began gathering at the monastery gates, some desperately begging for food, others angrily demanding to know why the Americans were protecting German women. An old man, his face contorted by rage, shouted that traitors should be punished, not sheltered. A young girl defiantly threw a stone that clattered harmlessly against the gate post. Fear had twisted every perception, contorting reality. Compassion itself had become deeply suspect. Inside the monastery, suspicion also simmered quietly among some of the American soldiers. A few grumbled openly that it wasn't their job to play nursemaid. Next thing you know, one muttered sarcastically, "We'll be knitting socks for the SS." Miller chose to ignore the comments, but the tension was undeniably present, a quiet, corrosive undercurrent. That night, over their meager rations, O'Hara muttered, "Feels wrong, doesn't it? Feeding the same folks who cheered while we bled in the Ardennes." Miller didn't look up from his mess tin. "Yeah," he conceded. "Feels right, too." The following morning, a wave of illness swept through the infants. Diarrhea, fever, hacking coughs, and fits of trembling. The American medics, skilled in patching up soldiers, panicked. They possessed antibiotics, but no one knew the proper dosages for such tiny, vulnerable infants. The German nurses, however, seamlessly took charge, moving with the quiet confidence of vast experience. They boiled water, meticulously sterilized bottles, and tirelessly soothed the fretful children throughout the long night. Miller watched them work, observing how sheer exhaustion and deep-seated instinct wove together into an almost balletic grace. When dawn finally broke, the fevers had mercifully eased. "They saved them," he said quietly to the lieutenant, a simple statement of fact. The officer merely shrugged, unwilling to overtly admit what both men implicitly knew. Without those German nurses, at least half the infants would have surely perished. Later that same day, a visiting army photographer arrived, dispatched to document scenes of civilian relief. He meticulously took pictures. Nurses in uniforms too thin for the crisp spring air, burly soldiers tentatively holding babies, milk bottles lined up with the precision of ammunition. He attempted to stage the shots, calling out, "Smile, sweetheart," but the women wouldn't. Their eyes carried too much of the war's immense weight. The flashbulb burst, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the room glowed with an unreal, stark brightness. Enemies momentarily caught in the same frame, neither victorious nor defeated, simply human. That photograph, though no one fully realized it then, would later become crucial evidence in an argument no one truly wanted to have. An argument about the very meaning of mercy when the ink of surrender was still wet on official documents. As the days slowly passed, life inside the monastery developed its own unique rhythm. The nurses and soldiers gradually began to share tasks, meals, and even hesitant jokes. The interpreter diligently taught the women simple English words, blanket, baby, friend. In return, they taught him gentle German lullabies. Yet, outside the monastery's walls, the fragile calm grew increasingly restless. German civilians, some weakened by starvation, others still clinging to a dead regime's loyalty, watched with suspicion through the gates. Rumors began to spread like wildfire. The Americans were consorting with war brides, rewarding those who had supposedly served the enemy's cause. A few even maliciously claimed the soldiers were fathering the very children they were protecting. One afternoon, as Miller carried supplies from the truck, he discovered crude graffiti scrolled across the monastery wall, scratched in coal, "Feeding the enemy." He stared at the damning words for a long time before angrily scrubbing them away with his sleeve. But that night, sleep evaded him. The idea gnawed at his conscience. He had come here to fight tyranny, to end suffering. Yet here he was, accused of treason for simply choosing compassion. That same restless night, an American major from headquarters arrived unannounced, his uniform crisp, his boots impeccably spotless. He immediately demanded to inspect the civilian quarters. The nurses, sensing trouble, stood stiffly at attention, visibly frightened. The major moved through the rows of cots with a stern clipboard, meticulously noting every perceived irregularity. He stopped abruptly when he reached Annalise, who was gently cradling a child. "Who authorized this?" he snapped, his voice sharp. Miller stepped forward. "I did, sir. They're feeding the orphans." The major's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Your orders were to transport civilians, Corporal, not to run a nursery." Miller's voice, though calm, was firm. "With respect, sir, we couldn't let them starve." The major studied him intently for a moment. "Compassion doesn't win wars, Corporal," he said coldly. Miller met his gaze, unflinching. "Maybe it ends them." The silence that followed was as sharp and sudden as a rifle shot. Without another word, the major turned away. The next morning, a directive came down. All German civilians, including the nurses, were to be transferred to a larger holding camp near Bamberg. Miller read the paper twice, his jaw tightening with frustration. He instructed the interpreter to inform the women. When Anneliese heard the news, she didn't cry. She simply said, "We go again." Her quiet composure unsettled him more deeply than any tears would have. That evening, as they prepared to depart, the villagers once again gathered outside the gate. Some shouted curses, others simply stared with hollow, accusing eyes. A young boy spat defiantly at a passing truck. The American soldiers ignored the taunts, but one of the nurses whispered a prayer under her breath. She wasn't praying for safety. She was praying instead for forgiveness. As the convoy slowly rolled out, snow began to fall again. Thin, drifting flakes transformed the ruined landscape into a ghostly tableau. The road wound through blackened, skeletal trees. In the back of one truck, Anneliese held a sick infant close to her chest, humming softly. The baby's breathing, fragile moments before, steadied, then quieted. Miller glanced back from the front seat, catching her reflection in the rearview mirror, the faintest smile, the smallest, most profound victory. He turned his eyes back to the road ahead. The war would be over in mere days, they said. Hitler was trapped in his bunker, Berlin nearly surrounded. Yet something deep within him whispered that the hardest part wasn't ending the war at all. It was deciding what kind of people would remain when it was finally over. As dusk began to fall, the convoy reached a crossroads. To the left lay Bamberg and the impersonal machinery of bureaucracy. To the right, a smaller, unpaved road wound toward the dense forest, a route where the map showed nothing at all. The lieutenant ordered them left. Miller hesitated for just a fraction of a second before obeying, the steering wheel slick beneath his hands. Behind him, the babies stirred restlessly. The nurses whispered amongst themselves. The snow began to fall more thickly. Somewhere far off, artillery echoed one last, fading time. Then, a profound silence descended, deep, clean, and utterly uncertain. And though no one uttered the words aloud, every soul in that convoy knew it. They were no longer simply enemies traveling together. They were witnesses to an act of mercy, and mercy in the midst of war was its own quiet, powerful kind of rebellion. Decades would pass before anyone truly spoke of the barn, or the monastery, or the unlikely convoy that had once moved through a dying Germany carrying babies instead of bullets. The world was too preoccupied with the urgent task of rebuilding itself, meticulously writing history in concrete and treaties, carefully choosing which stories to remember and which to bury under a shroud of silence. The photographs, too, slept forgotten, sealed away in an army archive, their labels faded, their subjects anonymous. It wasn't until the spring of 1971 that someone finally opened the box. The historian was a quiet, unassuming man named Peter Landrum, a university researcher diligently cataloging old U.S. Signal Corps film reels for a veterans project. He was searching for conventional battlefield documentation, maps, bomb runs, unit rosters, when he stumbled upon a small, unmarked envelope wedged between folders labeled Nuremberg Cleanup and Civilian Operations Bavaria. Inside were 23 black and white prints, their edges curling gently with age. At first glance, they seemed unremarkable. Soldiers, women, children. But something in their quiet intensity held Landrum utterly still. In one image, A nurse in a tattered uniform cradled a baby against her chest, her gaze weary yet unbroken. Behind her, an American soldier leaned over a makeshift stove, heating milk in a mess tin. The faded caption scrawled on the back read, "Schwag, April 45. Landrum looked closer. The soldier's face, half in shadow, half illuminated by the firelight, bore an unmistakable tenderness that seemed to have no place in the brutal landscape of war. He turned the next photograph. A row of cots, infants swaddled in makeshift blankets, nurses bent over their charges like saints. A faint American flag, incongruous and almost shy, hung behind them, tacked to a splintered beam. A shiver ran down Landrum's spine. This was not the kind of image history typically preserved. There was no triumph here, no dramatic surrender, no triumphant flag-raising. Only mercy. And mercy, he mused, was the one profound thing for which war truly had no language. Landrum meticulously traced the photo number to an army inventory and eventually to a veteran's name, Corporal David Miller, 7th U.S. Army Medical Division. The official record stated he had been honorably discharged in 1946, returned to Illinois, and died in 1959 of heart failure. No mention of the photographs, no citation for heroism. Just a file that concluded in official silence. But inside that silence, a story lay waiting. Months later, Landrum successfully tracked down a surviving German nurse, whose name, Anneliese Schreiber, appeared in post-war Red Cross correspondence. She was 83, living in Munich. When he arrived, she greeted him at her door, a small woman with bright, alert eyes, her hands trembling slightly from age, not nerves. On her mantel stood framed photographs of grandchildren and a faded Red Cross pin. He told her what he had discovered. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, she offered a soft smile, like someone remembering sunlight filtering through falling snow. "They asked us to feed them," she said, her English slow but clear. "Not their soldiers. Their babies. Orphans. So small. So many." She led him to a drawer brimming with old letters and papers, carefully tied with ribbon. Among them, Landrum found a photograph identical to one of his own prints. The same barn, the same stove, the same woman holding the same child. But this one bore a note, written in careful, elegant script, "To the kind Americans who forgot we were enemies." Landrum listened intently as she spoke. Her memory was uneven, as all memories of war inevitably are, yet some moments remained astonishingly sharp. She vividly recalled the bitter cold of that spring, the distinct smell of kerosene and milk, the rumbling sound of engines outside the monastery gate. "We thought they would arrest us," she recounted. "Instead, they asked us to help. One man, Miller, she thought, brought the milk. He looked afraid to touch the children. Then he smiled. I had not seen a smile in years." She laughed quietly, a soft, dry sound, shaking her head gently. "He gave me his gloves before they left. Said, I'd need them more. I did." For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the rhythmic ticking of a clock loud between them. Landrum felt something profound shift within him, a dawning realization that history, for all its grand narratives, was often composed of gestures so small they almost vanished. "Why did no one ever tell this story?" he finally asked. Anneliese looked toward the window, where the Munich traffic gleamed under a soft rain. "Because it was not victory," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "And no one wants to remember kindness when there was so much shame." That night, in his hotel room, Landrum carefully spread the photographs across his bed. He contemplated all the grand narratives built on fire and destruction, and how this one quiet, domestic, profoundly humane tale had been so utterly overlooked. He wrote late into the night, meticulously piecing together unit records, diaries, and interview notes. The next morning, he dispatched a letter to the U.S. National Archives, formally requesting permission to publish the images in an academic journal. The reply arrived months later. Approval granted, pending final clearance. The photographs, at long last, would finally be seen. When the article eventually appeared the following year, under the understated title Mercy Among Enemies, The Nurses of Schwag, 1945, it caused only a brief ripple within the academic world. But it generated a much deeper wave among veterans and civilians who stumbled upon it. Letters began to arrive, from former medics who vaguely remembered a barn somewhere near Nuremberg, from German women who recounted their mothers whispering stories of Americaner who gave us milk. None could pinpoint the precise location or exact time, but all spoke of the same astonishment, compassion appearing where it had no logical reason to exist. In the end, Landrum's piece evolved into something far more than a mere footnote. A small museum exhibit soon followed, occupying just one modestly lit room. The photographs hung in a solemn row. Soldiers and nurses, the flicker of firelight, and the innocent faces of infants, all unguarded. Visitors often lingered longest at one particular image, that of Annalise gently feeding a baby while Miller watched from just behind her shoulder, his helmet set aside, his expression neither proud nor sorrowful, simply profoundly human. Beneath it, the simple caption read, April 1945, Mercy survives. Annalise herself attended the exhibit's opening, arriving in a wheelchair. She wore her old Red Cross pin, polished smooth with age. When asked what she remembered most vividly, she paused, her eyes glistening. The sound of them breathing, she said, her voice soft. The babies. Each breath was proof we had not destroyed everything. She paused again, then added, and the American who said nothing, but stayed until the milk was warm. Later that evening, as the lights dimmed and visitors slowly trickled out, Landrum found her sitting alone before the photographs. She was humming softly under her breath, a melody faint and broken. He recognized it from a note he'd found weeks earlier in Miller's field journal. A German lullaby. Don't know the words, but it stays with me. The historian quietly left her there, a silhouette among ghosts, the room glowing with the faint, silvery light of captured mercy. Outside, night settled over Munich, like ash and forgiveness intertwined. Years later, school children on museum tours would point to the photographs and innocently ask their teachers, were they friends? The teachers, perhaps possessing a wisdom that transcended the scope of historians, would smile gently and reply, for one moment, they remembered how to be. History rarely carves out space for moments like these. It meticulously counts victories, not tenderness. It glorifies flags, not hands reaching out. But in those forgotten photographs, time itself seemed to pause, a poignant reminder to whoever looked closely enough that even in humanity's darkest, most brutal hour, someone still chose light. And somewhere, perhaps beneath the rubble of that old Bavarian barn, a single nail still rusted in the beam where an American flag once hung, marking the hallowed place where enemies had fed the same children, and for a breath of history, forgot the meaning of their division.